Welcome to Lesson 2, Lecture 1, Realism, Defining Power. Before we get started talking about power, we do need to do a little bit of background on different international relations theories. We've talked about these in previous lectures. IR theories provide a shorthand of state behavior. If you talk about realism, as we will today, people understand that you're talking about power. If you talk about liberalism, people understand that you're talking about economics. You may still be talking about power, but you're talking about it in a different kind of way. You're not thinking about military power as much as other kinds of power. The primary theories within international relations can be classified as realist versus idealist. And one way to think about realist is people that think about the world as it is versus how it should be. That's a pretty big simplification, and many argue that realists see the world in ways that it really isn't as well, seeing too much danger and focusing too much on conflict and power. But as a shorthand, this is a way to begin thinking about realism versus idealism. Throughout the next few lessons within Module 1, we will be talking about other theories of international relations. However, realism is perhaps the most dominant theory, so we'll be discussing it more. And as I said, it is the dominant theory, not necessarily because most of the scholars believe all of the tenets of realism, but nearly every scholar who talks about international relations does have to account for the realist view in some way or another, even if they disagree with it. So one of the central tenets of realism is power. So we have this definition by Goldstein and Peterhouse in the textbook on page number 45. Defining power as the ability to get another actor to do what it would not otherwise have done. Another name for this is influence. But there's a problem with this particular definition, and that is this danger of circular logic. Power explains influence. Well, the U.S. was able to get Mexico to change its drug laws because of the power that the U.S. has. Well, we could also say that the U.S. was, by persuading Mexico to change its drug laws, the U.S. showed its power. So it's a circular definition, because you are unable to really distinguish between those two portions of it. You see influence, you explain it using power. When you're talking about power, you talk about the influence that a state may have. There's no real way to get out of this loop. So most often, especially in realism, we think about power as a capability or a potential capability. It's the potential to influence others to do what you want them to do. And so potential and capability is more easily measured. You can think about income, the size of the economy, the actual size of a state, the physical size, the size of the army that a state has. So these are things, the armed forces of a state. These are things that you can measure. You can count up the number of tanks and soldiers. You can measure how much economic activity is going on, and we can look at a map and see, well, the United States is big, and Japan isn't as big, size-wise. Then we can look at the size of their economies and say, well, the United States is big, but Japan also has a big economy. So what other factors could we look at? So you can compare different measures. You can look and and see and think about these potential capabilities in a way that's more easily understood, and that isn't dependent on then talking about kind of a hard to measure concept such as influence. Realists recognize that power provides only a general understanding of outcomes, so there are other factors, and realists, even hardcore realists, account for other factors besides power. When thinking about power, it's not all, especially when we're talking about relations between states, it's not the absolute power that we're interested in. Mostly it's the relative power. When we're talking about the United States and Russia, for instance, and we'll get to this at the end of this particular lecture, the ratio of power between two states is an important thing to look at. During the Cold War, the relative size and power of both the United States and Russia was the constant kind of discussion. Who has more missiles than who has a larger military, who has more capabilities to bring to bear. So this is an important factor. An example of this is the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. So that wasn't just an issue of power, and the authors in the textbook note that the U.S. was much more powerful than Iraq in terms of military and capabilities and everything else. But even after invading Iraq, the U.S. was not able to easily impose its will and make that state over in a way that it perhaps wanted to. So exercising power, even when there are these large disparities in relative power, even when a state is very powerful, is difficult. Alright, so measuring capabilities. We can look at long-term versus short-term capabilities. Short-term capabilities could include the size of your armed forces today. How big is your Navy? How big is your Air Force today? Whereas long-term, we're looking at, well, what's your potential to build more armies? What's your potential to recruit more soldiers and more airmen and more seamen? So long-term versus short-term capabilities. Again, as I've mentioned, realists see that military force as a crucial element of national power, and this is because it's the most immediate way to influence and the most dramatic way to show off your capabilities. Even realists, so as I mentioned, talk about other issues, and states will cloak their use of power in terms of morality or the greater good or peace as a way to soften the use of power. So even when states do use power, they often don't just say, I'm bigger and more powerful and this is why. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, that was done in order to stop Saddam Hussein and his human rights abuses and to prevent any potential collaboration with terrorist groups. It wasn't because we don't like Saddam Hussein, we're more powerful, and we're just going to do what we want to do. So the way that we talk about power is important. And geopolitics. So geopolitics is a mixture of talking about the geographic feature and power. So where states are and how their particular position in the world can influence other states. One example of this is the idea that the United States is a military power, as a sea power, with the ability to control the sea both in the Atlantic and the Pacific, but is also relatively safe from invasion from other countries. We don't have to worry about other countries really doing much damage to us because we're protected by those oceans. So this accident of geography of where we're located plays a great deal into the way that we behave as a state. So that's what geopolitics is. So one last example of capabilities. This is from a project that I did. The Correlates of War is a database that many international scholars use, and they have a capabilities index, so it kind of measures potential power. It measures things such as the ability to produce iron and steel, energy consumption, population, and military size and military spending. And then those capabilities are compared to all these capabilities of every other state. So this particular graph shows the capabilities of the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the U.S. and Russia from 1950 to 2007. So it covers most of the Cold War and about 20 years after the Cold War. So on the left-hand side, you see the number there. That is a overall national capabilities index. So in 1950, the United States had almost 30% of all the world's capabilities as measured by the Correlates of War. And the Soviet Union had just under 20. Now, those two states then had half of the world's power in terms of population, military spending, steel production, energy use, those things that I mentioned before. The closest other countries were way down below the 0.05 level. So you can see why it was that the two superpower countries were the focus. They had so much more power than everyone else. And you can see that there were some periods where the Soviet Union stayed relatively stable throughout that time, and U.S. capabilities as a share of all the world capabilities declined for a number of years and then kind of steadied off here around 15%. You can see at the end of the Cold War in 1990 that Russia's capabilities took a huge hit, and it dropped down into the 0.05 level. Now, that is still a very powerful country. Russia is still a great power, and we'll talk more about great powers later. But the United States stayed where it is, and the United States was then left as the last superpower. Some call it a hyperpower. It's got so much more power than the rest of the countries, the rest of the states in the world system. But this is one way of measuring power. It's a very realist way of measuring power, and it's a way to compare the power of other countries. So I thought that this would be a good example to show you how realists can quantify, think about, talk about the use of power. So we'll leave off there for now.